think I see that there's sort of two philosophical constructs in terms of risk assessment. One is leaning towards the precautionary principle that if there's significant evidence or significant studies saying that there's a danger, we ought to slow down. We ought to proceed with precaution. It's not saying, as you said, there's no per se issue about GMOs, but before things get into the environment and they're irreversible, if there are significant studies, even if studies on both sides, we ought to move with caution. The other model I see is that, well, is there undeniable evidence of harm? And I find that I can't concentrate when you're talking. Okay. The other model is more that whether there's undeniable, who's died, where is it? Prove it. Prove the harm before you stop what could be irreversible. So I think what, our county or these other local communities, in looking at this question, are trying to say, let's just hold in place. And that's what I'm trying to do. I think some of your scientific things I'm putting in my companion. I'm not going to discuss the ad hoc committee, but let's leave that to the further discussion and just halt. But my question really is this what I see, this difference in philosophies really there? I mean, it seems like some countries say, okay, we're going precautionary principle, and then the FDA are the ones I expect to take care of us. It's sort of, well, there's no reason to regulate this Kentucky GMO bluegrass. It just looks fine and it doesn't fit in our definition, and let's just let it go, and there's no substantial evidence of harm that it's going to destroy the world. So I just comment on that.
I think that is an excellent distinction, and I love the fact that you added the word irreversible. You see, I would have hoped that this is a technology that has the ability to affect everyone who eats, all living beings, and all future generations. So it's fairly unique in the history of humankind. And because it has such a huge risk profile where it could affect so much, it seems logical that before we ever release any outdoors, so it becomes a permanent feature of the ecology, we would extinguish all doubts. So if the precautionary principle were designed for any technology on Earth, this is the technology, because once you open the door, you cannot close it. We've seen that with invasive species, but this is like invasive species on steroids because it affects the ecosystem in so many ways. Now, you said undeniable evidence of harm. Obviously, we have undeniable evidence of economic harm. We know I worked at the laboratory that discovered Starlink corn, unapproved for human consumption. We discovered it in Kraft taco shells. That was $1 billion loss. I already mentioned two other $1 billion, or the rice was $1 billion loss. There was a huge loss also with wheat. So there's undeniable risk of economic harm in Hawaii. There's undeniable risk when you look at the animal feeding studies, and if you see what has happened to these animals that have been fed GMOs, potentially precancerous cell growth, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, multiple massive tumors, early death, organ damage, smaller babies, fewer babies, 5 times the rate of infant mortality, hair growing in the mouths, birth defects, etc. We have peer-reviewed, published, controlled studies on GMOs that have this much higher statistically significant effect in the animals that are fed GMOs. And if we want, and as I said earlier, there's plenty of correlational evidence and anecdotal evidence, and from where I stand, it's pretty overwhelming. But even if we're not convinced that it's overwhelming, and many people are not exposed like I am day in and day out, I think theoretically, I think your point is very well taken. This is an irreversible technology that'll certainly impact health, environment, and economics if anything was miscalculated, if anything is wrong. And in protecting the Aina, in protecting the future generations, it seems like, yes, there's plenty of decades or months or years in advance where we can introduce it. But until then, let's do the homework which should have been done long before this science was introduced.
Okay. on the question of vulnerable populations, I know I've heard that our generation, or this time is the first time that it's our youth that are less healthy as a generation, the first time that's ever happened. And I see that all around me, and I see testimony, well, even our one of our testifiers, Larry Gehring, say, look how healthy I am. Look, we've been eating GMOs. But my reading, and I'm not sure anyone's saying this, it's really that the youth, it's the young, or it's Dr. McGath tested, as well as perhaps those races or groups that are more vulnerable to the kind of diseases that are affected by microorganisms in the soil. Like you take the magnesium out, you get more diabetes. And so perhaps the Hawaiian population might be even more drastically affected. So in looking, we talk about vulnerable populations, and I just wonder, I'm just speculating, but it just does appear that it's sort of the younger and the unborn and that we're looking at, and whether it's anecdotal or not, it just seems so prevalent.
I agree with you completely. In fact, Dr. David Schubert of the Salk Institute said that children will be the experimental animals in this uncontrolled experiment. When mice were fed BT corn, they found dramatic immune responses in the young mice. And there was slightly less in the older mice, and hardly any in the adult mice. When I speak to pediatricians like Dr. Michelle Perro, she's seeing in recent years an increase of tremendous digestive disorders that are very complicated, failure to thrive, allergic to every food group, and all sorts of cognitive disorders. She's convinced that GMOs are part of that puzzle that explain it. In fact, many, many mothers have said that when they take their children off of GMOs, they get better both behaviorally and in their health. And we know that the BT toxin can poke holes in human cells in test tubes. If it also happens inside our gut and we create permeable gut, that could lead to inflammation, autoimmune disease, food sensitivities. It's linked to cancer, autism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, gluten sensitivity. I released today a 24-page paper with four experts, including a gluten guru and an MIT scientist, linking GMOs to the rise of gluten sensitivity in the United States. But again, all of these, I think you're right, go to the most vulnerable population, the children. And what are they fed? Infant formula, if they're not breastfeeding, which comes from genetically engineered soy, perhaps, has genetically engineered corn, it has milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone, which has so much of a cancer-promoting hormone in the milk that it's banned in Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc.
Okay, let me move, just because I don't want to take up all the time and let others talk to you. But one of the questions that's come up is in terms of open-air testing of papaya. I don't care whether it's experimental or non-experimental, just testing, and whether we're trying to, my bill is like trying to just halt in the sand. Everybody's doing whatever today, can do it tomorrow, till we look at, questions in this follow-up committee. And we're trying to also, the papaya industry was directed in this direction. They did everything that was legitimate. It was legal. They were assisted. And so we're trying to balance. There's a balancing going on. But one key question, and one for me still, is in the interim, how risky is it to allow the papaya industry to do more outdoor testing in the interim rather than limiting that to indoor testing?
So, in my opinion, if they're introducing new traits that haven't already taken over in the ecosystem, those new traits can carry a lot of potential problems. And I would have wanted the papaya to go through long-term feeding studies for sure, possible human clinical trials, and et cetera, before introducing it. Now, Hawaii is one of the most vulnerable, if we talk about vulnerable populations, because you have so much papaya already growing. If you do an outdoor field trial of a new trait, it's guaranteed to spread to other papaya. In fact, the people who were promoting the GM papaya told those organic producers, if you want to protect your trees, put a bag around it, every single flower, so you don't get pollinated. They acknowledged that the pollen would transfer. And we saw that, of course, in the numbers of contamination. So if you are willing to expose everyone who eats papaya and every single papaya plant to a new trait that's never gone through all of that, that carries a huge risk. So my feeling is right now the existing papaya is out there. It's already infested or colonized or cross-pollinated or whatever the word is. But if you're introducing a new trait, I would put the brakes on and say, put it indoors in a negative pressure situation in a secure environment, and don't put it out there because it's guaranteed to be permanent.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to yield.
Okay, we have Councilmember Onishi.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, I have a couple questions for you. First one would be, how do you feel about biocontrol?
When you say biocontrol, what do you mean?
Well, using biocontrol to combat against invasive species.
Well, do you mean
Or-
GMO control or like biological intervention, adding a virus to the rabbits in...
No. Well, okay, I don't know if you have, if you know about the coffee problems we're having in Hawaii. Do you know anything about the coffee, like the berries?
I don't know about the problem, but if you're talking about introducing viruses or bacteria for biocontrol,
Yes, like say, like what had to one time with the strawberry guava, there was an increase of growth, so they wanted to bring in, I think, some kind, was a moth or something like that, like some kind of control thing to control the growth of the strawberry guava.
yes, okay, so I talked to a guy who won the World Food Prize, Hans Herren, for doing biocontrol in Africa, where he saved the staple of 20 million people by introducing a wasp that was going to kill something that was destroying the cassava. And he spent years studying the environment, the eco response to it, before he was willing to take this wasp from South America and expose it to Africa. And even when he did it, he knew that he was risking a catastrophe, but the alternative was a catastrophe. So he did it, it was successful, and he saved the cassava, which was the staple of so many people. So I'm not an expert at biocontrol. I tend not to speak outside of the area of my expertise because I've just been focusing on GMOs for 17 years. But I can say from his experience, he was exhaustive and very cautious and was not motivated through funds or through economics, but through a serious life-threatening situation to a population. So I guess that's about as much as I can say about it, not being an expert at biocontrol.
Okay, so say in a reverse side or a different situation, say like say for example the papaya industry where the ring spot virus came in, and so with technology, with I guess you could call it biotech, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So by using biotech, they help to control, or they try to keep the papaya immune from that virus. Is that correct?
Yes, and like theoretically, I completely believe that it's possible to manipulate the DNA with new genes, etc., for the betterment of health and the environment. On a theoretical basis, I'm not against it. Knowing what they did, knowing the level of, it's like a scientific arrogance that they tested like these 3 or 4 things and then ignored 100 others with a technology that was permanently irreversible and part of the papaya gene pool. That, I think, was inappropriate. And of course, they found out later that the papaya was more susceptible to the black spot fungus. We found out now that the two assumptions about the RNA and the proteins may be completely wrong. They never tested to see if humans were getting an impact from it in terms of their health. So if you look, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, and then the next thing would be, you've been online for a while, so I think you heard the discussion earlier with Dr. Valenzuela. Yeah. Okay. So now, Mr. Iligan mentioned about Japan's research to see if the rainbow papaya was safe or not for them to import.
Yeah, so I personally don't think that Japan actually conducted animal feeding studies. I was disappointed in their decision. I don't think it was backed by proper science, but I also know where Dr. Valenzuela was going when he talked about WikiLeaks. And I hear this direct. I hear this from ministers of agriculture, ministers of trade, ministers of health. The pressure on these other countries is intense. Sometimes there's bilateral trade agreements with the United States that are secret that stipulate the opening of doors to GMOs in order to get an economic package. And so I would not expect that a political decision, as we saw in the FDA, was motivated primarily or at all on a scientific basis.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I've seen around the country and around the world.
Okay, and then my last thing would be, so do you have Bill 113 in front of you?
I have it on a computer, so I can't get onto it while I'm talking on Skype.
Okay. What I wanted to do was put an amendment where it's going to exempt the flowering and ornamental plants.
I don't think we can discuss the amendment.
Okay. Well, would you feel an exemption on, say, the ornamental plants and flowering would be okay?
It's an excellent question because it's not something you consume, and so there's a sense that it's safer. The risk profile is more defined. At this point, I wouldn't personally, for a number of reasons. One, most of the GMOs either receive Roundup or produce Bt toxin, and Roundup, we know, can affect soil fertility for years. The longest recorded half-life for the degradation of Roundup's active ingredient was 20 years, meaning you spray Roundup, part of it may stick around in the soil for decades. And the continuation, you plant next year's crop and next year's crop, and you keep spraying, and the fertility can get less and less. Also, there's relatives of the GMOs, like canola, which is, 95% of the canola is GMO. It's in the brassica family, and it could pollinate with broccoli, with cauliflower, with Brussels sprouts. So we may be eating genetically engineered crops that have never been commercialized. So there's that. There's also the effects on the insects, on the birds, on the microorganisms, none of which have been thoroughly researched. And when you look at the independent research, they all point to problems that need further study.
Okay.
So I would say no for now.
Okay, and so now, I don't know how familiar you are with our Enturium industry.
No, I'm not.
Okay, and what happens is that you have these different types of varieties that are coming up with different colors and so forth within the Enturiums. So you would say that by having that plant, that would be a danger to contamination to other plants or crops around on the island?
We're quickly getting to the edge of where I can speak with confidence and not. Since I'm not familiar with the ecosystem piece here, I'm not familiar with where there is the relatives and where there's not, where there's cross contamination capabilities. I do know that the biotech industry has gotten it wrong. The salmon, for example, that they want to release turns out can mate with trout, and their offspring can be even more off than the original genetically engineered variety. That was a recent study. So I'm going to leave that to the environmentalists and the ecologists to go into the details of that. But we do know that the technology around GMOs, the traits that they put in, they have, in addition to the Roundup or the Bt, it has this collateral damage effect where it might increase a protein, decrease a protein, introduce a new one that's never before existed,
I'm
and
talking
none of
about
that
the
is
plants.
evaluated in the ornamentals.
Okay, but I'm talking about the plants and ornamental. So
Yeah, and so exactly. So the ornamental may have a protein that's increased, which can change its structure in such a way that might have an impact on the insects that eat it. You know, because like, for example, in Monsanto's BT corn, there's also something called gamazine, which has never before existed in corn. And the gene is completely silent in corn, but not in Monsanto's corn. Because when you insert the genes, you typically do it with a gene gun or infect it with bacteria, and then you clone it. That process can switch things on or switch things off. And right now, you know, if in an ideal regulatory framework, you would know if that ornamental is changed and you'd know how much it was changed. There could be, like in Monsanto's corn, none of which were evaluated before the corn got on the market. So it's not just the insertion of a new color. There are other things that happen that no one talks about. And the biotech industry say it's just like taking a page out of one book and putting it in another book. If you shred some of the text in that recipient book, that's more like it, because you end up causing 2 to 4% of the DNA to be different, mostly because of mutations.
okay, thank you. I yield.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Elegant?
How's it going, Mr. Smith?
Very good, thank you.
In your world, what would it be like? Would it be all non-GMO?
So in my world, there would be no genetically engineered products in the food supply and no GMOs grown outdoors.
Okay.
There would be genetically engineered drugs, there would be genetic engineering and human gene therapy, and there'd be lots and lots of research before we release anything outdoors. And the assumptions that were used as the basis for safety claims, which have already been proven untrue, will be gone into much more in detail.
So why is it that genetically modified drugs is more acceptable to you than a rainbow papaya?
Great question, thank you. First of all, I did say very careful, because there was a genetically engineered food supplement called L-tryptophan that caused about the deaths of about 100 Americans and 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. And our investigation showed that it was almost certainly the genetic engineering of the bacteria that produced the tryptophan that caused the problem. But within the drug context, you have a specific drug that's given to a specific person. There's a specific risk that they decide to take. Same with human gene therapy. People have died getting human gene therapy, but the therapy was designed, it was trying to save their life from something else. As
So,
opposed
Mr.
to
Smith,
exposing the entire population
I'm
and
sorry,
entire environment.
I have to do this because you kind of go on and I have a short limited of time. So I
Sorry.
apologize if I do cut you off, but I do want to ask you another question.
Please.
So if you mentioned that it's a risk that someone is willing to take. Now, if in your world that there's no genetically modified, it sounds like there's no genetically modified food. There's only human. Wait, say those three things one more time for me.
Okay, there's no GMOs in the food supply, and there's no genetically modified organisms released outdoors.
Release outdoors. And what are the three things that you said you are willing to accept?
Genetic research, genetic engineering on human genes, as long as it's not inheritable, so it's not something like we're changing the gene pool forever, and also drugs, as long as they're extremely careful and respect what can go wrong.
So it's research. Now, you said there's no genetically modified in the food supply. Now,
Right.
would this research include something inside, outside? Well, what?
You can research the food supply. You can research it, but just don't plant it outdoors until we have done the homework. Dr. Ignacio Chapella
Okay,
from
done
UC
the
Berkeley
homework.
said,
Now,
put it back in the lab for 50 to 100 years
So,
till they've
Mr.
done their
Smith,
homework.
what is doing the homework?
All right, so a professor said to me, it used to take one day in a class to teach what a gene is. Now it takes a whole semester, because all of what we thought we knew about genes is untrue. When you look at the language of the DNA, the whole genetic technology was based on the wrong assumptions. So part of the homework is understanding the networks and families of DNA, understanding what we used to call as junk genes, understanding epigenetics, understanding the influence of RNA, understanding the ways that proteins can have attached. Anyway, I'm going on. So there's a lot of things that I know that have changed in the last 15 years, which they thought they knew, but they didn't know it right.
So you're saying there is a point to where we can fully understand it? The complexity of it all?
I'm saying that when independent scientists and medical doctors look at what we think we knew, they are shocked and scandalized at the idea of releasing this into the food supply with such scanty knowledge.
Was that we can never get to a point where we are certain about GMOs.
I agree.
And now you're saying that we can get to a point that we can really research it and
scientists at the FDA said it's not ready, and the political appointees said it's not a problem.
Okay. Well, if someone were to, so there's no way you're willing to cooperate or collaborate an idea on the food supply?
I'm working on the labeling issue. Labeling assumes that GMOs are out there. I'm working with what is. You asked me in my ideal world,
yes,
which contrasts, with Monsanto's ideal world, which they said specifically was 100% of all commercial seeds GMOs. I'm like, no, put the GMOs back in the laboratory. We're not ready.
Okay, so we're not ready. I see. Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith.
You're most welcome.
Okay, Councilmember Wille?
Okay. On the horticultural floral question, when I first started thinking about this, I was sort of limiting the prohibition to where it had to do with human consumption. But then people sort of shook me and said, what about the soil, Margaret, and the microorganisms and the bees and the other beneficial insects and all of that? And so I pretty much said in my bill, if you're halting, we halt and keep the horticulture on the side of we need to address that in ad hoc or in the future. But just in terms of that whole idea of the horticulture and to what extent that there's less, I see harm less likely to be harmful and less likely to be as how great the potential harm. And I sort of feel this question should be moved into the second phase, but since you're here, I want to ask you that.
Well, I think you're right. I think when something is a non-food crop, then the harm is less. When something is you have to check to see whether it might cross-pollinate. That's way beyond, it's above my pay grade. You have to figure out what the species are, et cetera, and I'm sure the people at the university there can tell you. But I think you're right about, for example, the bees. There was a study that found that when bees collected pollen from a certain type of corn, Liberty Link corn, they ended up transferring the gene from the Liberty Link corn into the microorganisms inside their gut. This was discovered by a German scientist. There was another study where they found that the bees that were collecting the pollen from BT corn, they ended up getting viral infections, and the controls did not. Also, the GMO corn has 5 times the amount, in some cases, of the neonicotinoid and nicotinoid insecticides, which are known to contribute to colony collapse disorder, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever you have pollen, you can affect bees. Bees are extremely vulnerable, and I know bees are very important in Hawaii. So these, like when they released the BT corn, and a Cornell researcher found that it might damage the monarch butterfly. I wrote about this in Seeds of Deception, where they said it would cost $300 million to evaluate the impact of the corn on insects, and no one's going to spend that money. Now we found out that the Roundup is killing the population of the monarchs because it's destroying the milkweed, because it kills all the other biodiversity in the fields, and the milkweed is where the larvae of the monarch butterfly flourish. So that was either discounted. In fact, the USDA researcher said about the monarch butterfly, this is part of the background noise that we expected as a result. So these things have to be very careful, especially in Hawaii, where you are known for, and one of your greatest treasures is the lush tropical paradise and biodiversity.
On the horticulture, I think there's certainly many people that feel the more we can be natural and nature and on this island, that niche versus artificial and GMO. I mean, the same thing with tourism. Our tourism, I see all of this as a great opportunity. Niche tourism, niche food, niche the island of nature and holistic. So I don't know how that is. I know, for example, the island of in Canada, Prince Edward's Island supplies all Japan with all its non-GMO soy. I mean, and they're just going very, high economics, and I guess you call that the high trend, but such an opportunity. I mean, we have diversity. We have 3 counties that are established and 1 where it's not. And we've got so much of the world doesn't want this, and so anyway, I just don't know in terms of your traveling around, to what extent there's sort of that understanding in terms of tourism and culture and that importance.
Oh yeah, I mean the thing is, anti-GMO sentiment is growing dramatically. The resistance and resentment to GMOs. I mean, the March Against Monsanto with more than 2 million people in 52 countries on May 24th. It was organized by a Facebook page. It was completely self-organizing. There's the fastest growing category of food sold in the United States last year was non-GMO label. So I think you're absolutely right. From a pure economic standpoint, there is the opportunity to be the non-GMO county. New Zealand is a clean green image. Then there's people that want to introduce GMOs to New Zealand. People are going, no, New Zealand's known for being green. How can you do that? And the thing is, it also impacts the export markets because the export markets recognize non-GMO zones. So when we had 25% of the corn genetically engineered in the United States, Europe canceled 99.6% of corn exports from the U.S., even though 75% of the farmers were still growing non-GM corn because it was intermixed and they didn't believe that they can get non-GM corn. So having a segregated area where it's non-GMO and everyone knows it and it's done well, it provides an economic opportunity at this time when there's hundreds of companies scrambling to get non-GMO products. I mean, literally, there's hundreds of companies. It was in the New York Times on May 27th. Companies scrambling to get non-GMO ingredients, and you can take advantage of that rising trend as opposed to being on the other side of it.
Okay, and lastly, in terms of nutrition, I understand that there are some tests showing papaya is equally nutritious, although maybe not as tasty. But there's also a lot of other crops that are, my understanding is, are far less nutritious. I think cauliflower, and I could name others, but my question really is for you. In terms of that, there's the whole thing. Some people say to me, Mark, come on, we have to get back to the whole question of sustainability and providing enough food for everyone. And I feel that we've advanced to, is it having a lot of food, or is it having a lot of healthy, safe food, and also protecting our soil? I keep coming back to my bills about soil, but that paradigm and that question, what is sustainability and self-sufficiency and resilience and the whole thing, it's not just about the quantity of food, it's also about having it be healthy food, and that we can grow healthy food tomorrow. We've got healthy soil.
Yeah, that's really well articulated. You don't have to choose between abundance and healthy. In fact, the jury is not out on this issue. There was a study with more than 12 million farms where they looked at sustainable agriculture and found an increase in yield by 79%. And for staples like corn and potatoes, 100%. The most comprehensive evaluation of feeding the world, which was called the ISTAD report by more than 400 scientists sponsored by the UN and the WHO and all that, they concluded that agroecology is the way to go, and that GMOs in their current generation have nothing to contribute to feeding the world, eradicating poverty, or creating sustainable agriculture. Union of Concerned Scientists report called Failure to Yield shows that GMOs don't even increase yield. They reduce average yield.
Okay,
so this whole myth that
that word agroecology, I just didn't understand what you were saying there.
So agroecology is a term that includes organic, sustainable, high nutrient dense, basically being aware of the ecosystem and planting in a way that builds soil, that builds diversity, that supports the environment, and ends up producing more food and nutrition per acre than the alternative.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we're going to close with Councilmember Ford. I'm going to talk about what we're going to do for lunch, if it's going to be a half hour or
Thank
an
you.
hour.
Mr. Smith, I want to thank you for being available to us from Arizona today, and thank you for responding to the invitation to speak. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, so lunch break. Do we want to do...
Would the people come up, the beekeepers?
Oh, no, because some people are real hungry already. Do we want to do an hour, a half hour, and what, Councilmember Ford?
Well, my lunch is here, so 30 minutes is what I'm looking for.
Could we do an hour?
An hour?
Whatever, I'm open to whatever.
Yeah. If we would have ordered, maybe about a half hour, but if we have to go out and get, then it's going to be about an hour, and I'm seeing people shaking their heads, so,
We also have to consider the public. The fact that giving them some time to have the lunch and enjoy.
So we're going to take a lunch break now, and we're going to reconvene at 2 o'clock. Okay, meeting is in recess.
Huh.